start recording early so I don't forget to do it. And I'm also going to introduce the absolutely fabulous WH Chong, who is probably the best book designer in the world, but definitely Australia.
Hello. That's too much.
It's nice to start with a good intro.
Thank you.
And Chong's going to talk to us today a little bit about his process, and I've asked him to talk in particular about his series design work, because he's done an incredible amount of series design. And what I would like, Chong, can you see all the little rectangles of people?
I can. Yeah. I have it in a grid view.
Great. What would be really nice is if just for a minute, everyone could turn their camera on and give us a wave. Just, I promised Chong that he wasn't talking to robots, that there were actual people behind there.
Yeah, prove yourselves, people.
Proof of life. Excellent.
And this is young Baxter.
Hi, Baxter. Where's Darko?
He is being neurotic and being on the ground.
Fair enough. Excellent. All right. Well, I feel like because it's 9:05, we're going to get started. Chong, would you like to do screen share?
Yep. Oh. Oi! All right. Is it working?
It is absolutely working, and we can see it.
Okay. So, shall I start the thing proper?
Well, I thought maybe we could start with just a little intro to you. So I've said that you're the best book designer possibly in the world, but I think it would be good to also do another intro, which is that Chong is are you the creative director? What's your title at Text?
I have a title that no one remembers, including me. It's just some vague thing. It means that I have been doing design at Text since actually designing its logo, which is now designing the logo bit is 30 years.
Wow.
So I've been there forever, and the title means something vaguely like that, but nobody knows what it is, and I can't remember either. It's just a stupid title.
So Grand PooBah of Design.
Something like that.
And was working at Text your first design job?
Oh no, heavens no. So I'm ancient, and I started in a newspaper at the age in Melbourne. And quite amazingly, I don't know how this happens, and it wouldn't ever happen these days, but my first job was straight out of college, was as art director of the new projects department, which sounds grander than it was, because the first publication I worked on was called the Australian Pensioner Weekly. So I designed things like the Australian Pensioner Weekly for a while, and then redesigned lots of things, including trying to redesign The Age, which back in the 80s was quite an ancient organ. And I tried to introduce a new font, which so horrified the editor that it never happened. And the new font I tried to introduce as a text body font was Times Roman. He said, that's too modern. So there you go. That's how far back I am.
And then how did you end up working at Text?
So I cycled through The Age, and then I went to the Melbourne Herald, as it was then. And then I started a little design company called, I know this sounds terrible, called WOW, W-O-W, which stood for World of Wonders. And then I started doing some basic design work for a new thing called Text Media, at which point I designed the logo. And then I just ended up inside of them. And around that time, or maybe a year later, they started a thing called text publishing, which was the books division, and which, when text media was taken apart and essentially disappeared about 10 years later, text publishing became a self-standing, independent Australian publisher of books. And so my drift into books, like most things in life, was accidental. So I think in the old days, because there's no such thing as a book design course, and really the only thing you could do in that area was pretty much graphic design, unless you were doing industrial stuff. So so what was my point? So you could only really accidentally become a book designer because you had done something, and then you ended up, working with people in books. And the famous, probably not so famous now because people don't remember anything, as everyone's under 25. McPhee Gribble, a very well-known, indeed celebrated independent Australian book publisher, very small. The designer was essentially Di Gribble, who was a sort of ex-architect. So you just design books because you happen to be in the right spot, or the wrong spot at the right time.
Great. I think that's sort of still the case, isn't it, Chong? Like, I'm not sure of anywhere in the world where there's a book design degree that you could do, or even a course.
Is there not? I have no idea. I don't know.
Let's find that out, and I'll let the students know. But at the moment, I'm pretty sure that you come through a general design
units, the book design units, are there or not? Are they just assignments, are they?
They're just an assignment.
Okay.
Well, I suppose, yeah. We don't really have a whole unit.
The industry is not big enough to support any such thing as a full course.
Probably not. But yeah, I thought maybe we could, after a nice intro to who you are and where you came from, a great way to start would be you just talking through some of your work with us.
Sure. Should I go through the share screen as you saw it the other night?
We can still see it. It's looking good. We can see your screen.
So do you want me to go through that now?
Deck? Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. So the opening shot is to do with a series that I designed in 2012, and text publishing decided to start an imprint called Text Classics, which has to do with reviving Australian books which were deemed classic, which had gone out of print, or which were well, essentially unavailable, of which there were many. This was around the time when there's a huge furore, because it turned out that at that moment, no Australian university was doing any Australian literature courses, which is a pretty stunning sort of idea, that your entire tertiary curriculum cannot actually even afford to have one course about your own national literature. So anyway, this happened to be a coincidental moment. And so we decided to start the Text Classics. And one of the things about this that I realized was that, unlike something like Penguin Classics or Vintage Classics, we didn't have famous names to depend on. We couldn't, stick on the thing James Joyce. We couldn't stick on the thing Virginia Woolf and then immediately capture the viewer's interest. So my strategy was to announce the series more than anything else, which is why Text Classics is huge on the cover. And the author name was quite likely for most readers unknown, as would be the book title, because we were essentially dragging stuff up from the past. There were a few famous authors, but not really. And in Australian terms, I have to say, just having been through all this stuff, and there are now 140 of these titles, when I speak to friends and people, you know, the historical memory and knowledge of Australian writers and so on is extraordinarily limited, and somebody who knows a lot about this stuff is quite rare to find. So it'd be like, it's a strange thing. It'd be like going to an American kind of literary space or university and saying William Faulkner, and then everyone looks at you blankly, as if, you know, who is William Faulkner? You know, who is Herman Melville? So in Australia, that condition applies, that many of the well-known writers in the days are really quite important, famous Australian writers do not have a name anymore. So my choice was to make sure that everyone knew that this was an Australian text classic, and then the trick would be to pull them in through having a interesting or powerful cover. So on the right of the screen, you see around the time we launched, we stocked up the bookshops with piles of this stuff, and with many of those covers. How do I go to the next page?
You should be able to just click the arrow on your keyboard.
Arrow on my keyboard, really? It's not happening.
Let's
see if there's an arrow anyway.
Do you want to? You may just have to do something slightly clumsy, which is unshare, move to the next, or yeah, press the down key. Have a go at that on your keyboard.
Oh,
there you go.
Did it work?
Beautiful.
Okay. Right. So, so now we have the essential template, as you can see on the left of the screen, is a space for an illustration. And then you have the furniture, which is the top left, the logo, and then the author name, the book title, a little introduced by line, which is quite important because we always have a new introduction for each classic, and the series imprint title at the bottom. And there's always an element of yellow in the cover, which is another decision because yellow seemed to be the most visible color one could find to get people to look, even though it is a bit strident and a bit loud. However, we needed to make a noise with on a minimum budget, let me tell you, which is to say none. So going from left to right, we have The Getting of Wisdom by Henry Handel Richardson, which used to be very well known because it was assigned to school, I don't know what grade. And one of the things that this cover exemplifies is that we were trying to make the classics contemporary. We're trying to make the connection with a contemporary readership audience. So, you know, what would have been set in a Victorian era girls' school, we have tried, or I have tried to make kind of interesting and now. And then we have David Ireland's The Unknown Industrial Prisoner, which is just a mad collage of things, which is very like the tone of the book, I have to say. And that's just an example of kind of a photographic collage use. The one on the right, which is a...
Can I ask on that first, have you generated all of these images yourself?
A large proportion, I'd say about 3/4.
Great. And you're using, like with the collage one, you're using found stock imagery or... Yep. Yeah, great.
So that was constructed entirely from bits I got out of iStock images.
Yep.
iStock because it's really cheap and available. The one on the right is a marvelous book from West Australia by Kenton Mackenzie, utterly forgotten until it was sort of dug up again. This is a fantastic thing about puberty, I think. Anyway, the cover image hasn't got anything explicitly to do with that, but it does have to do with kind of like sort of spring and life and sort of a bursting of new things. So what I did was I put together a bunch of stuff, some photographic and some drawing, and just kind of have a sort of a scene of just sort of a strange Western abundance. I'll go to the next screen, see if it works. Okay, so on the left is Ned Kelly's famous Geraldry letter. As you can see there, I have made a little contemporary intervention. And the next one is an erotic novel by Linda Javin called Eat Me, which starts in the food aisle of a supermarket. And then the next one is Patrick White's short stories, The Cockatoos, which is a photographic thing with a bit of Photoshop jiggery-pokery. And the one on the right is taken straight from a documentary photo of Peter Rose, who's the author, on the left in the red jumper, and his father and his brother, who are two very famous Australian football stars. And this is his memoir. Okay, so that's that. Any questions while we're here?
There was one question in the chat earlier, which was a kind of more general question, which is, would some or most of these books be in the public domain? So I guess it's a question about the publishing of them.
Because of the date of these things, there would only be a couple, which maybe 4 or 5, because they dated back to kind of settlement times. Like for one would be for the term of its natural life, because it's truly antique now, over 100 years. So most of these would actually have to be accessed through copyright and the author's estate usually.
I have a question about the Text Classic series design kind of logo.
Yep.
You've hand generated that yourself?
You mean I did it by hand?
Yeah. And so choosing to do something, because one of the things that we did a hand-generated typography workshop a couple of weeks ago, and thinking about when you use hand-generated typography. And I suppose my question is about kind of the balance between something that is unique and hand-generated and then the straighter typography you've used for the author name and title.
I think it's a tricky thing, and in this case, it was certainly a mood decision on my part. I think it went this way because the other kind of classic imprints all had this very clean sort of typography, and it just felt like we needed, because we have no publicity budget. It's a new and not well-known kind of imprint. We have no famous authors, so everything needed to basically generate its own publicity and visual interest and make its own space without any kind of sort of substantial financial support or anything. So everything was just aimed at making a noise.
Yeah, and I also love that when you get to the cockatoos, you break from your own series design, as in like you've set everything up with a version of a yellow background, and it doesn't have to be the same yellow every time. It just has to be kind of boldly yellow.
Yeah.
But cockatoos doesn't need that.
No, they they have their own gold.
And so I guess that I'm just pointing that out to the students in terms of like setting up a series. But as you said, that there's about like 140 titles in this series. And so sometimes it's going to be okay to break it.
So as time has gone on, we've loosened that whole yellow thing, so it doesn't become too overwhelming. So a lot of the later titles have a more subtle or more discrete area use of the yellow trademark. Besides, it's on the spine on the back, so it is unmissable in terms of sheer kind of acreage.
Yeah. Great.
Next.
Yep.
Okay, so This is an example of a reworking of a title. On the left was the original trade C format trade paperback, which came out, I think, 3 years ago, 2.5, 3 years ago. And the cover image, which is quite an unusual and very uncommercial kind of collagey thing. But if you look through at the background, there's kind of a magic eye thing there. If you look through in the background, you see that there's actually a landscape. And the landscape is taken from a poster of Tasmanian highlands made in the mid-20th century by the Tourist Board of Tasmania. And on the back cover of this edition, we actually showed the poster design without any collage bits on top. So you could actually see the original. By the front, it just becomes part of that kind of torn paper look. And when it got put out into the B format this year, I took it in a completely different direction and hand generated, or basically illustrated, elements from the book and made the type the central thing. And there's a lot of type because it had a lot of rave reviews, and the margins of the cover are decked out in the kind of glowing reviews from all the different kind of publications. So you can see that there's kind of a huge leap from one thing to the other, not least being the size of the author's name. The author is now somebody who is got a following and has sort of press interest and so on. So there are things you do at different times for a book cover, depending on, you know, whether or not it's the author's first book, or whether the author is well known, or whether if the book has been very well reviewed and so on.
And Chong, I think that when we're talking in this project, and I'm talking to the students about, they have to have a kind of consideration of the content of the book, what the book's actually about, but also the context of the book. And this is a really good example of that both these covers, designed by the same designer, are really playful with how they deal with the content of the book. And actually, when I read Flames, I was only about halfway through reading it when I realized that element on the front cover was kind of drawn from the element on the back cover. And I had a great little like aha moment, which is, you know, one of the things we've talked about too, is kind of hiding things from the reader. So as they develop a relationship with the book, you might have like another, it's like, you know, when you suddenly see a side of a friend that makes you look at them differently and think, wow, that was really clever. I had a really great aha moment with that book. But I think the kind of context of the book, an example of that you've made really clear here, is that like when the book first came out, Robbie Arnott was not really known. And then the book was so well reviewed that the context of it kind of demands that his name is bigger.
Well, one of the things is a trick, and you have to be careful how to use it. The trick is that you can make the author seem important by making his name big. You can just kind of fake it. But if it's not supported by the text itself, if the text has no quality, then you're playing quite a dangerous game, because it just looks like it becomes apparent that you are faking it. And that just takes it in a negative direction. You are basically shooting yourself in the foot. So you do have to be careful, but you can do it. You can make an author seem more important than they really are.
Or mistakenly less. Ash was actually in a bookstore the other day looking for the new Richard Flanagan novel. And I just thought of that because Flanagan's name's on that one.
Right.
And he walked around and he couldn't find it. And he had to ask the person in the shop to help him find it. And he showed it to me when he got home, and he's like, why would you not make Flanagan's name really big on the cover of this? And I had to explain to him that the way that the type interacted with the image was the decision of what was bigger. But I think that was a kind of interesting case of someone not finding the book because they were looking for the author's name and it had been minimized.
Well, I think the Richard Flanagan cover, which I think it's useful for your people to to look up after this or during this if they like. It's a very good example of a decision. And I'm sure it's very conscious. So if it were me, and if my understanding of this thing as always is to sell books, you would definitely make Richard Flanagan the biggest thing on the cover. But that they've chosen to go in such an uncommercial kind of direction, it's very interesting to me. I don't really know why you would do it, because if it was me as designer slash publisher, whatever, I would absolutely do the commercial thing, because if you don't sell the book, then it doesn't matter how clever or beautiful the thing is. And in the case of Richard Flanagan, well, I just think it doesn't matter. You could have a black cover and just his name, you know. It's anyway. That would have been a long discussion, and I am just spouting off, and I'm sure they had very good reason for doing it.
I'm sure too.
Okay. So this is a series. This is not a series at all, actually. They're just 4 examples of just plain type design. Well, plain or not plain, as you like. And I do a lot of type design covers, because you, as a designer, you have to have an armory of things you can go back to. Or really, maybe that's reverse engineering. You would discover that you have a tendency towards things, and then you can choose to make them your go-to places. So one of the things I think about when confronted with a cover brief is whether or not I can do a typographical thing to it. So as an example, on the left, a book which came out last year, there's a book by an Australian political historian, and she wrote a book about, as the subtitle says, how Australia got compulsory voting. So the idea here was to make the very long title, which is a problem in itself, actually turn it into a virtue by giving it the same format as a voting ballot, which kind of solved, you know, lots of problems for me. The second one here from the left is a book by a German essayist, theoretician, social commentator, public intellectual, blah, blah, blah. And this is its English translation. And it's a memoir about how she grew up with this complicated sexuality. And this is a very simple idea. Arriving at a simple idea is always hard, but once you get it, it should look very simple. It should look like, oh, of course. So how I actually got to this solution, I actually have no idea, but it seemed to work immediately. It became apparent to me. And surprisingly, I didn't have any pushback from the editorial or publicity people. The next one is one of my favorite things. It's a book by a very well-known, bright young thing of America called Ben Lerner. And he wrote a short, I think quite terrific book about why people hate poetry, called The Hatred of Poetry. And I thought, well, I don't know how I actually ended up doing this, but I knew straight away I wanted to use a typewriter, a real typewriter, which I have an old, 40-year-old typewriter, which I bought with my first pocket money kind of thing. And I knew I wanted to do something with it. And then, of course, because it was about poetry, I wanted to make a concrete poem. I assume everybody knows what a concrete poem is. And then when I counted the number of letters, it was perfect. I could just about do it exactly. So this is an example of really cheap artwork. This is a one-shot typewriter, straight off the typewriter onto a bit of paper, scanned into the machine. I have to tell you, I had to type this many times because I kept making mistakes. but you know, this is as cheap as artwork can get. And the one on the right is a very famous book by Lionel Shriver. We need to talk about Kevin, which was made the film with, what's the name of that strange?
Tilda Swinton.
Tilda, yes, Tilda. And the story about Kevin is that Kevin's a very disturbed boy who commits a really terrible murder spree. And there's really no explanation of why Kevin became such a monster. So the cover reflects that entirely with the simplest of means. Again, a very cheap bit of artwork, I have to say.
Chong, what I really love about this cover too is, and I think the poetry one that you just talked about as well, actually this whole series, like deceptively simple looking artwork. Like the frustrating thing about when you kind of nail it and get it really right and it looks really simple and you go, yeah, of course that's the cover. What that masks is how much process actually goes into it, but also your kind of years of expertise as a book designer. But for me, we need to talk about Kevin, just the subtlety of how you've dealt with the extra quotes and things in handwriting and just perfectly slotted them in around the artwork, the kind of scribble pattern making. The whole thing just holds beautifully. If that was done less well, it could look like a really bad book cover, like a really badly done thing. But the combination of the kind of classic typography, the hand-generated typography and the mark making, like you've pulled it together in a composition that looks like it is meant to be that.
The trick about these kind of things is being very careful with details. So this would not work if the transparencies of the color layering weren't right. Now, you have to be able to read the title, but you also have to be able to slightly not read it. All of these covers really in the end depend on this most important thing that all your students should know. There's nothing as important as a good idea. If you have a good idea, then your challenge, which is an exciting challenge, is how do you best manifest the idea. If you don't have a good idea, you're struggling to make a not very good idea look good. If you don't even have a semi-good idea, then you're really in the ditch. The most important thing, I don't know how you get there. This is a constant mystery to everyone. I've done this for a long time and I can't give you a formula, is to have a good idea. It's a trick. I don't know. You just have to find a good idea first. That's the most important thing. Next.
Next.
So on the left of your screen, you see what was the supply proposed rough for book of essays. And the publisher said to me, can we do something? And it looked pretty uninteresting, I have to say.
Chong, can I just ask who supplied that rough?
I cannot say.
Okay, but it wasn't you that supplied the rough.
No.
Okay.
That was given to me and it said, can you do something with this? So this is a really interesting, sorry, I just have to stop the dogs. A very interesting exercise in reframing. So here's a supplied rough with all the details that you might need, okay? So you have a title, a subtitle, an author or editor line in this case, and a whole bunch of words which indicate all the grandmothers who have written the various essays in the book. And in this case, a whole palette of colors too. So the question is, what can you do with this thing that would make it more lively, more immediately visually compelling, more kind of cheerful and promising, all these kind of various marketing terms, you know. So so I arrived at the thing on the right. I mean, this went through several iterations. Oh, well, I should say like 24 iterations. But in fact, the original thing, the leap from left to right, happened straight away. It was essentially the same thing. It was a blue bowl and a bunch of, well, it's not even a bowl, right? It's a kind of a semicircle and a bunch of other circles in orange colors. And this happened straight away. The only difference is the kind of scale of things and the type and the overall kind of space within the cover. But the jump was immediate. And I tell you the story because it's an example of ideas. So I do not know where this idea came from. I just know that I looked at the thing on the left and I thought, the most important thing here, apart from the title, are the authors, because there are lots of recognizable names for this readership. There are people like Ramona Koval, there are people like Helen Garner, people like Maggie Beer, people like Elizabeth Chong and Stephanie Alexander and Cheryl Kernot. I mean, these are really important names for this readership. I thought we need to make a feature of these names. But so you're trying to balance a whole bunch of words with, you know, a title word, which has to be strong, but then you need to just balance it so it's not too strong. And then you got to pull out the editor's name as well. So how do you make this all a visual thing that's very simple as well as can support a whole bunch of detailed meaning inside of each name, and each name has a hierarchy too, you know, like their kind of first name and second name. And I cannot tell you except that I had a thought saying, wow, this could be like a harvest, you know, this could be like a gift. And I just thought, let's just have a bowl of fruit. So I can't tell you how this idea comes to mind, but I think one of the things is you just have to be open to being able to unthink something. So the thing on the left is so rigid and so kind of stifled with the burden of having all this type that the person who did it was struggling with the brief, I guess, and because I was coming at it at the next level, you know, that this was given to me. I didn't have to think through all that stuff. It had been done for me. This person had basically suffered through the horrible burden of this brief, and all I had to do was like kick it apart. So if I'd been given the brief without the supplied rough, I probably have to go through the whole process of doing this awful thing before I could get rid of it. So it's a very difficult thing to get through some of the earlier part of the process, the kind of befuddling, tedious stuff before you can sort of make something, something with a bit more life in it. So I'm happy to report that this book, which only came out earlier this year, was one of our bestsellers. I'm sure not just because of the cover, but because the cover made plain that all these very interesting people were writing stuff which related to a lot of our readership, who are grandmothers or who are the mothers of women who wish to give them a book.
And Chong, I think listening to you talk about that process, like there was a moment where you came up with a metaphor, which was the idea of a harvest. And then you found a way to kind of a way into your design process, maybe through that metaphor, and thinking like harvest, bowl of fruit, there's a kind of conceptual link, but like rather than going bowl of fruit, I'm just going to draw a whole bunch of apples and oranges, you reduced it down to a kind of abstract thing, which goes like harvest, bowl of fruit, circles as constraint. That would allow me to have all the names there. And I think that kind of working through the metaphor is really important, because one of the sets of books that the students are designing is a backlist of Alain de Botton's books that are, you know, The Art of Travel, The Architecture of Happiness.
A perfect problem.
Yes, which is a tricky problem too, because there's already a metaphor supplied with the words like art and architecture.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go for the literal representations of those things, then you're kind of working against the verbal metaphor. So if you go art of travel, I'll put a frame around it, you're kind of, it's almost like you're weakening the strength of the verbal metaphor. You have to find a way to work through that.
I want to say that that's not always the case. You can be literal. So one of the covers for that Art of Travel was literally putting a frame around travel, which was the plain window. They literally had the travel outside the window, and they framed it with a window frame. So you can do it.
No, I agree, but it was a window frame, not like a kind of gold gilt frame.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
it's taking, like, you going from like harvest to bowl of fruit is the same as going from like kind of picture frame to window frame. And I actually really like the window frame version, because it puts me in the position of the traveler looking out the window.
Yeah, I think that element of abstraction is very useful. So in this cover, the only bit that takes it out of abstraction is the hint of a shadow under the blue bowl that makes it a blue bowl. Otherwise, it's not a bowl. And being able to allow that kind of non-literal abstraction in the cover design is I think, quite important.
Yes.
It's hard to explain why, but it just is.
I agree. And it's also, just for some of you who are asking if you can use vector graphics in this project, because we've been kind of pushing a bit against using Illustrator a bit. This is a vector graphic cover that has a lot of life and spontaneity to it. And the decision to put the shadow in there is what holds this whole thing together.
It's done entirely in InDesign.
InDesign, great.
And this is even cheaper as artwork than scanning. As you can see, one of the things I have learned to be good at is to do very cheap artwork.
Which is kind of a necessity of commercial design practice. And that's something that the students are learning through this project too. They're not allowed to use any stock images at all, because part of it is actually going as part of your practice, or as you said before, like your arsenal, is that you have to be able to make original imagery relatively quickly in a commercial practice.
Yep. So here's talking about commercial constraints. On the left is a new translation in English of a very well-known book written in Berlin in the 1920s. The title of the book, which comes from the German, is quite an accurate rendition as far as I can tell, is literally what happens in the book. There are two women who conspire to poison the husband of one of the women. And when I was doing research on this period, because the publisher first wanted, oh, just give me some scene from Berlin in the 1920s. I thought, oh, okay, which sounded really boring, even though Berlin in the 1920s was not boring. Anyway, I looked through all the possible images, and it's actually very hard to find an appropriate image from that time that has to do with this title. It's just kind of like, well, there's no connection really. But I came across this wonderful kind of series of bits of art and collages by George Gross, who was a very famous artist of the time, Berlin. And this fantastic kind of strange thing seemed to fit the bill. And everyone in marketing liked it, and the publisher was keen. And the translator, because the author is well and truly dead, of course, translator thought was great. And then I did the thing which maybe I should have done first. I looked it up and exchanged emails with the person at Getty Images. and it was way too expensive, way too expensive. It was kind of like pointless even thinking about doing it. I was thinking, oh no, we have an approved cover and we have something that's very expensive and we don't have very much time left and the publisher is not going to be very happy about this. I mean, I knew immediately. I saw the price was too expensive, so I told everyone and said, "Oh, yeah, you're right. That's I don't know. Let's do something. You do something rather." So then I had to do something, and of course, I fell back onto hand-generated, cheap hand-generated art. And I did a very literal kind of thing. I represented two. Well, it could be women, I guess, figures. And then I did a fool around the type because it's such a long title, you might as well make a virtue out of it, was my thinking. So I had two components then. I had the idea of making simple artwork showing two figures, and I had a long title to play with, which is how this final version came about. And everyone was really happy with it because it looked kind of like modern and at the same time cost nothing.
So that is a very good anecdote to support our conversation there about the importance of being able to generate your own imagery quickly in a commercial practice.
Yeah, out of commercial necessity in this case.
Yes.
So this one, I think it's the last one. It's just an example of something that's currently in the shops now, which again has a self-generated bit of art. So this is a book-length essay by an author who is become very well known in the US and should be well known everywhere. She's quite remarkable, and she has the most wonderful name. And I think this is her fourth book essay, and it's about property ownership and its relationship to everything to do with race relations and economic relations and sort of social political meanings. It's quite fantastic, but very kind of very simple, very readable, very mysterious how she actually makes such a strong argument out of just essentially sounding like having a conversation. And so this idea is to do with money, of course, but quite how this idea arose is again a mystery. So I'm just making this point that ideas are mysterious things. It's like trying to capture something, and well, maybe you can, maybe you can't, and mostly you can't capture it. It comes to you. You can't go to it necessarily. The kind of methods you can use to try and get there, but whether or not it comes to you is another thing. I mean, this is just my own metaphor, and this is just my own experience. Sometimes I'm sure there are people who have very solid methods of getting there, but it's never worked for me. So the reason why I had this idea is because I actually own the red wallet. In fact, like so I have this red wallet, and I thought, let's use the red wallet because I love red and black. It's almost my favorite color scheme. I thought, let's just do it and see what happens. So I scanned in my wallet. I thought, what can I do with it? I mean, it's just a wallet. And then I just had this notion, you know, which we can articulate, but I don't think there's any need to say it. I think it was a visual thought, and I think it can remain a visual kind of a meaning. I mean, the minute you look at it, the second you look at it, you kind of understand something about the title, you know, you have, but also you haven't, you've been had. So I think it all connects in a non-verbal way. And this is an example of how an idea comes through you just because of proximity. Just because you have one thing means you can go somewhere with it. So there you go. That's my little screen story.
Chong, what an amazing collection of images.
Thank you.
And an amazing collection of books. We've got a tiny bit of time for people to ask questions. So quickly chuck them into the chat. Or if you're feeling brave, turn your audio on. Yes, you can. I think you can. Yeah, there you go. Okay. So does anyone have any questions for Chong? Because we have him here. And also, thank you so much for your time and generosity talking us through your process. But any questions for Chong?
I had a question about your typography-based design that you were doing. So I'm wanting to explore that as well in one of my experiments. And I wanted to get your opinion on whether typography-based design should have other elements such as graphics or imagery or any other hand-generated like artsy stuff, or whether it should be solely the typography that speaks for itself, because I don't want to make it too empty, but also I don't want to make it too overwhelming if I'm going for a typography-based design.
The type is graphics and type is imagery. So there's no correct answer to this. I have a totally impure view about these things. I think you can use whatever you want and combine them in whatever way you like. And the only criteria is that it should work, whatever it should work means. I think in this case, it's like, what does your lecturer think about your solution? I don't think there's any limit to what you can put in or any need to put in something else if your type can do the whole job. Because you still have color and you still have space. You know, you can play with space and color and the type without bringing anything else in as well. You should try and do 2 or 3 versions, one with just type, one with a bit of artsy stuff, one with a bit of some other bit of graphic, whatever. Try it.
Great. Somebody else in the chat has asked, do you find it hard to balance your creative ideas and the demands of the brief?
I don't really know what it means.
I suppose if the brief has kind of limitations to it, do you find it hard to, if you come up with ideas that are kind of more creative than the brief will allow you?
Well, there are 2 things. One is the limitations are the limitations. And when you read a brief, you should already have that in mind so that whatever you're exploring, you know, quite likely stays within that, because there's no point in making trouble or pain for yourself. And then if you happen to have a good idea that goes beyond the brief, you can manifest that too and show it to them. And they might say, yeah, that's great. We would never have thought of that. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful idea. Let's do it. I have done that quite a few times.
And I
but
think
first have a plan A, and then do your plan B.
I mean, I think one of the other things is that these guys are in first year and this is the first time they've tried a book cover design, but we've played this game before. Roughly how many book covers do you think you've designed, Chong?
I did stop counting quite a long time ago, but over 2,000.
So
here's my advice about all these things. Do more than 1 version, do 5. Like normally a cover designer given a brief is quite likely to do a dozen or 20, you know, it's not a big deal. Just, you've got a computer, just do as many versions as you can.
Yeah. So I'm going to combine 2 other questions then. One of them is sort of about describing your idea generation process. And the other one is like, when do you know when you've got the right design or when to stop?
Say it again, please.
So the first question is about describing your idea generation process, like how you come up with ideas. And I think you've sort of answered that a bit. Like you've gone like, sometimes I have a red wallet in my pocket and I see what I can do with it. And other times you think through and go like harvest, bowl of fruit, circles. But I think the other question is like, when do you know when to stop? Like if you stop at red wallet before the dots, or if you stop at bowl of fruit before you get to circles, like you haven't completed the idea generation. Like, when do you know which point to stop?
So this is how long is a bit of string kind of question, and what is string kind of question. I think the knowing about the stuff is a question of experience, and that sounds a bit like catch-22, because how can you have the experience unless you've had the experience? And the only way to do it is to make stuff. So it's not flippant advice when I say do 10 versions. I'd say do 20 or 30 versions. I just say you don't know, you just do it and do it and see what happens. You won't know, actually. And then you get some feedback from friends or your lecturer or whoever. And then you begin to refine your own grasp of what does it mean to say this thing works. That is purely a function of your design confidence. You can't get design confidence without doing it and doing lots of it. That's the only way you'll get there. You cannot get there in one step. You have to take 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 steps. That's the only way. It's just work.
I think that's a great ending point for Chong's time. So could I get everyone to put your screens on and just a wave and a clap and a thank you? That was so great. And also thinking of you in Melbourne and your kind of opening up.
Oh, Melbourne.
I know. But thank you so much. What an incredibly generous lecture and talk.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much. I hope you guys managed to have a good year anyway, despite all this stuff. Just get absorbed in your design and forget about the world.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice too. And we can look at more of Chong's work also on the ABDA website. There's lots of Chong's work.
Go to my Instagram.
But go to Chong's Instagram and follow him. He does
WH Chong
wonderful things.
Book covers or something like that.
I'll find it and put it in a link for them. We're going to do a tiny bit of boring, like kind of housekeeping university stuff. So Chong, you certainly don't have to stay for this, but
I won't.
Thank you again, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, cheers everyone. Bye.
Great. I was going to keep it sort of within the 10 a.m. boundary. We're just going over a tiny bit, but it was so much fun talking to him that I felt like it was fine to keep going. Did everyone enjoy that? Yep, so a couple of thumbs up. I really love hearing other designers talking about their work, and it's so great to see someone who has been working on one thing for so long. To have one, to have one practice that you follow throughout your career. I mean, of course, he doesn't have one practice. He started earlier in publication design, in newspaper design, but just kind of listening to someone talk about their work that happens over like a 30-year span, I think is really inspiring to me. And I think what's really nice to think about there too is that, you know, Chong's saying that he's designed like over 2,000 covers. Think about your practice as something that happens over a long span of time. This is the first time that you've had a go at designing a book cover. And Chong's telling you that some of the things that he's designed recently have taken like 26 different iterations. It's still, when I'm working on things, it's still, and all of us who are teaching you are designers, it still takes us like 10, 15 goes to get towards the right idea sometimes, let alone the kind of iteration process that you have to do after that. So I think the most important thing that I would love you to take from listening to me talk about my process and Chong talk about his process is that you can't do one pencil sketch and think that you're then going to take it to the computer and make it. That is not how design works. We talk about a practice, we talk about an iterative process, and it's really slow and laborious. And every time I'm working on a new brief, there is a whole kind of period of it where I think I'm not going to be able to do this. This is going to be the one that I fail. I can't come up with an idea. It's not going to work. What am I going to do? And then click, it happens. And that's the bit that Chong's saying, that he can't explain when that bit happens. I can explain it. It's hard work. You keep working through, you keep looking at what you're doing, you're reflecting on what you're doing, and somehow every time it clicks and comes together because you actually have an ongoing practice. There are times when it doesn't click and come together. And what Chong showed when he was showing the grandmother story ones is that there was a moment that another designer was working on something and just went, it's not happening. Or the publisher goes, it's not happening. And this is really awful, but that's called killing the designer. I've only been killed on 2 jobs, but I found it really, it was really humiliating, and I felt really distressed afterwards, because it's like, oh my God, I've failed. But it's not a failure. It's just, it can happen sometimes in the commercial world. Sometimes you just get stuck in a process and you can't find your way out. The 2 times that I got killed were times when I wasn't asking for help and I didn't have any feedback from other people. So another thing that I guess I want to talk to you about is the importance of talking to each other, not just waiting for us. So if you think about, we talked about running this subject in the sense of running it like a studio. In the 2 jobs that I got killed on, I was going to the equivalent of the kind of studio leader, which was the publisher and the editorial team. And I was showing them what I was doing, and they were giving me feedback, and I was going away, and it wasn't working what I was doing. But I didn't talk to anyone else. It was at a kind of lonely point in my process when I didn't have other people to talk to, and I realized I needed a community of practitioners. And I have that now. Even though I don't work in-house in places, I have other people I show my work to. So the reason that we want you to give each other feedback on Padlet, and we want you to show your work to each other, and we want you to do group crits in the breakout rooms, is because you have to learn how to listen to critique from other people and sift through it. No, I don't think that's a good idea. Yes, I think that's a good idea. That sounds like a great idea, but then I've tried it and I'm not capable of doing that thing. It is this kind of ongoing conversation that you have to have with other people and learning how to develop and move through it. Chong was really generous when he talked about that grandmother's cover, and he said this other designer went through the kind of hard part of this process where when you look at what that brief would have looked like on a piece of paper, it was a longish title and then this list of names. Getting a brief like that is really hard and overwhelming. And another designer went through the kind of like messy early process of getting it to a point where it's like, well, it could look like this. And then he took it from that point and worked it into something better. So sometimes you get really stuck. What are you going to do about it? You have to find ways to manage your process, and asking other people, how do you do it, is really difficult, because part of the answer is it's hard work. And another part of the answer is experience, which is what Chong said. And that's difficult for you guys because you're in the first year of a degree. You don't have experience yet. This is, for, I assume, all of you, your first experience of designing a book cover. And this is the other thing that we're trying to teach you. So much of this, it's like it doesn't actually matter what the cover is you make in many ways at the end of this, or the 3 covers. It matters about the process that you've gone through, because that is the learning experience. So the next time you get given a book cover project or a magazine cover project, you've already been through this process. You've learned things that you don't know you've learned along the way, but you won't make those mistakes again, or you're starting from a different platform. You're starting from a different level of understanding of how to work within a template. That some things seem to work really well in your head, but when you try to fit them into a rectangle, it just doesn't work. That you have to start playing with typography a little bit earlier. That you have to think about how the word and the image kind of come together within the frame of the cover. So all of these things that you're learning, you might not quite nail it with your book cover project here, but what you have learned along the way is so much more valuable than this thing that you think you might put in your portfolio. The process is what we're teaching you. Chong's saying, I don't know how I come up with my kind of ideas and iterations. We're trying to teach you that this semester. We've given you a theme to concept sheet. We've given you a triangle that's showing you, think about what is the content, what's the idea that I'm working with, what are the graphic elements, what are the material elements. Chong doesn't have to think about that stuff because he's been doing it for 30 years or more. That's called tacit knowledge. It's something that you build up as a designer or a practitioner where you just start to know things. And that's why people who are really good at what they do can't explain it. Because it's like, well, it's actually my 40 years of experience of doing this that tell me when to stop, that tell me to try this, that tell me that this will work for this kind of context of the book and this might not. So what we're trying to get you to do is understand that design is an iterative process, and you're at the beginning of your process, and what you're learning is incredibly important, whether you see it right now or not. So what we're going to do today is go into the breakout rooms. We have a 5-minute break so everyone can stand up and move around, but have a chat to each other about Chong's work and his process. Be excited about what you just heard. People actually pay a lot of money to hear Chong speak. And he came in and did it with you guys for free because he's lovely. And he cares about design and he likes talking about it. Think about what you can learn from him. I think the kind of kernel of it for me was that there's nothing as important as a good idea. Spend time generating that good idea. Use the concept triangle to figure out how you take a good idea and turn it from something abstract in your head to something visual and material within a rectangle for your project. So please make sure that you have your work loaded onto Padlet, but could you also please make sure that you don't start by talking through the work that you don't think you're going to do. If there's a draft that you've done that you're like, ugh, I don't want to work on that, don't show it to us. We don't need to see that. What we want to do is spend the time we have talking through your best idea or ideas and talking through ways to kind of improve and work through that. We're going to give you some typography exercises to do in breakout rooms where we go through and give feedback. Use this time to talk to each other and figure out how you can actually develop a community of practice, how you can ask for help, how you can help people help you. It is really important to learn how to ask for help. So I feel quite inspired by Chong and his work. I hope that it helps you feel inspired. Another good thing to think about is the very first slide that he showed us was the template for his series design for the text classics that showed front, spine, back. We've put a template in the UTS Online subject documents task 2 resources folder that is an InDesign template that shows you how to put it back. Great. So everyone can go to your own Zoom links now. And we'll see you in sort of 5 minutes. But I think the other thing that's worth saying is I am going to run a lecture next week. We said that we weren't, but I feel like we need to have one more kind of touching base and going over Q&A about the project, but also just about the subject and where you're at and what we're doing. So we will have a lecture next week, but it's going to be quite a loose one. So thanks to everyone who came and made it. I feel like that was a really good experience and I hope you feel kind of buzzy and excited by it. Have a chat to each other about it. See you soon.